Wandering the vegetable markets in Peru was, for me, sort of like stepping into an alternate reality. Many things there are so familiar that it was easy for me to forget they came originally from there. Not from Canada, not Europe. But at the same time, these familiar things came in completely different shapes, colors, and flavors, and even ways of cooking. The Andes Mountains are an incredibly diverse region and contain everything from deserts to rainforests to temperate highlands, all the way up to tundra. And for thousands of years, people groups, states, and empires, the Inca, Nazca, Wari, Moche, and many, many others have worked to make this place habitable in all these zones, finding wild edible plants, getting plants from neighbors, and breeding them to make them more productive and useful for humans. And so, when Europeans reached the Americas, many of these crops were then spread around the rest of the world. Things like squashes, peanuts, sweet potatoes, in modern times, quinoa. But there's a few where the differences are especially surprising between the types we see in North American grocery stores and the multitude grown today in the Andes. Here are just a few of my personal favorites. Let's start with the potato. To many people, potatoes seem a very generic European food. Europe and maybe the States, kind of a stereotypical synonym for bland, uninteresting European-derived cuisines, which is not quite fair to the potato or to some of those cuisines. But the funny thing is, go back 500 years, and Europe did not have the potato at all. Historically, potatoes are solidly South American, and it shows in just how ridiculously many varieties they have still growing there today. How did they end up in temperate countries like Canada or Ireland if they came from a tropical country? Well, they're mainly from the cooler highland parts of South America, an area where the climate really reminded me of warm, late summer days with cold nights back home in Canada. But potatoes are also grown to some extent up into the tundra and down to the deserts at sea level. You can see it in the art of some cultures there, such as these peculiar and sometimes surreal ceramic drinking vessels from the Moche people. They were a civilization that lived down on Peru's northern coast from around 100 AD to the 5 to 700s, still more than half a millennium before the Inca, and they're well known for their quirky ceramics. But in Canada, stores have 3 or 4 types of potatoes, maybe a few dozen if you go to farmers markets. In the Andes, however, estimates typically run over 3,000 varieties. Now, how different could all these varieties be? Well, quite a bit, actually. At a glance, all kinds of different colors, both inside and out. Pink, purple, yellow, orange, white, black. Some will have different textures, some waxier or chewier, better for mashing or frying, different sweetness or other flavors, different nutrient levels. Different shapes as well, some round and squat, some long and snake-like, some, like this one, warty and knobbly. You might think those ones there look pretty impractical, and that was actually part of the intent with those ones. Imagine trying to peel those quickly. Now imagine that failing to do so will mean you may not get to marry your fiancé. This was a custom in some parts where a hopeful bride-to-be would visit her future in-law's home, and her potential mother-in-law would test her with this to see if she was worthy to marry her son. Hence the Quechua name for this, Liumchoy Wakachi, or makes the daughter-in-law cry. So lots of diversity in these potatoes here, and this interests a lot of agricultural scientists and organizations, just as it did many Andean farmers long into the distant past. Because in the Andes you have so many different growing zones with the jagged mountains, with slightly different microclimates, different pests, diseases, soils, and levels of rain and drought, you end up with many different potato types specializing in those different conditions. This was a tough, unpredictable area to farm, and Andean farmers realized that it was a big help against the all too common crop failures if you planted multiple varieties each year. It certainly didn't eliminate all the risk, but it's a lot less likely that all of your varieties will fail in the same year. And it would be sad to lose all these potatoes' traits, whether for the sake of breeding new varieties or growing those old varieties in new niche environments. But there's one interesting potato I'd like to highlight. As you go higher up these mountains, when you near the 4,000 meter mark in the cold, windy grassland of what's called the Puna Zone, you'll start to see a lot of a particular type of potato called huaña. one that you wouldn't expect to be that useful. These are bitter potatoes, not very palatable. But up here, you work with what you have, and these potatoes are much more cold hardy than most. So for at least the last 1500 years or so, people from the Tiwanaku civilization, and possibly others much earlier, found a way to make these not only edible, but one of the most valuable Andean foods. These were used to make chuño. Now, some people watching might say this isn't a true chuño here. More on that in a minute. But how they make this stuff is really interesting. Because these people were, and still are, up high, right close to the permanent snow peaks where nights can freeze, but the day still has intense tropical sun, and the atmosphere is dry and thin, the conditions here have allowed people to do a traditional type of freeze drying. After digging them up, the potatoes are left out overnight and allowed to freeze solid. As they freeze, many of their cells will burst, releasing water, so when the potatoes then thaw in the daytime sun, they can be stomped and squashed, kind of a dance sometimes, and the water is easily squeezed out, and with it some of the chemicals that make these potatoes bitter. The next night they freeze again, and the process is repeated. This continues for a few weeks until these things are bone dry and shriveled up. There's plenty of variations on how this is done, and this one right here, some people might call it white chuño, but others might call it instead tunta or muraya, reserving the word chuño for black chuño, like I was showing before. This takes a slightly more involved version of the process, involving interrupting the drying with washing or soaking or somehow remoistening it before continuing to dry again. Sometimes they also put these ones under blankets instead of in the direct sun. It varies a fair bit from place to place, but the key difference is with black chuño, once it starts to dry, it doesn't touch water again. This one does. I did find this handy flow chart in one source that shows how different potato-based foods are made in the Andes. It leaves out a few details, such as that tokosh over here is fermented, but it gives a good general idea. As you probably guessed, these white chuño are more labor-intensive, and accordingly were historically the more valued ones. For many of the civilizations and people groups here, potatoes were quite a highly valued food. For the Inca, it was one of the less prestigious crops, but even for them, this was food for the elites, and everyone else had to settle for black chuño. And today, these are the main ones exported as well. Why is that, though? Well, as far as I read, it's because this version of the process does a better job getting the bitterness out of these bitter potatoes. That extra washing step seems to help dissolve more of the bitter chemicals out. That, and maybe also just the extra washing, they're more likely to be more clean, less dirt on them still. Black chuño is definitely still produced today, and you can see it at the markets, but it's more likely to be eaten on the farm, less likely to be sold and exported. Because these people groups had no wheeled vehicles, only limited help from pack animals, llamas, people usually carried much of their supplies on their backs. So the lighter and more nutritionally dense your food, the more you can carry, the better. And if it stores well for years, even decades potentially, so much the better. So major staples for travelers and armies back in the day. So useful, but how does it taste? Well, the one source I read, I believe it was Terence Daltroy, called it a delicacy of dubious flavor to a foreign palate. I'm curious if he meant black chuño, which I haven't tried. I did try making a basic preparation of this stuff here, just soaked it for a day or so, and then boiled it for about 2 hours with some salt. They're often mixed with other flavors in soups and stews, but here I wanted to just taste the chuño itself. And in the end, I would say it actually tastes almost exactly like gnocchi or some other potato dumpling like that. Like even the smell before I boiled it really reminded me of raw wheat flour and potato. And it has kind of that chewy potato dumpling texture. Maybe slightly crunchy, but I wonder if I just slightly undercooked this one. Yeah, not bad at all. Nice and hearty, filling. I can imagine that going well with a lot of things. Just probably want to add some other flavors, which I guess speaking of which, if we're looking for other flavors we can add, may as well go to the next vegetable. When you think of peppers and spicy food, what is the first cuisine that you think of? Thai, Indian, Mexican, maybe Chinese? Well, again, go back 500 years, and most of these countries would not have had peppers. Peppers are from the Americas, so Mexico would have had them. This is a Mexican pepper here, but they didn't have all of them. There are over 40 species of pepper in the capsicum genus. 5 of those are domesticated. And from 3 of those 5 come most of the thousands and thousands of varieties of peppers grown around the world today. Those 3 species were definitely present in Central America, some of which the Aztecs and the Mayans would have grown, and their range also extended down into South America. But the other 2 domesticated species, probably my favorites of the 5, come mainly from the Andes Mountains and haven't spread past them nearly as much yet. Capsicum baccatum and Capsicum pubescens. Today, Peru and its neighbors may not have reputations for ultra-spicy cuisines, but peppers are a big part of their food and, again, have been long into the past. This moche bottle, it's a bit harder to see, but on looking closely, it appears this guy's hat is decorated with peppers. Or this Inca bowl has peppers that are easier to see. But even today, if you've ever tried making an authentic Peruvian recipe, you've probably seen these in there, especially the one variety of Capsicum baccatum, ají amarillo. This pepper is used in like 3/4 of dishes in Peru. Probably not quite that much, but it's a lot. Whether fried as a vegetable, made into a paste and added to sauces or potatoes or marinades, and that really doesn't surprise me. I quite like the flavor of these. When I tasted one straight, it kind of tasted like a really sweet bell pepper with maybe a bit of citrusy notes and a bit of pear, actually. This species comes in a lot of different shapes, sizes, and flavors, but they tend towards citrusy or other fruity flavors, hence the species name baccatum, meaning berry-like, and hence also popular varieties with names like lemon drop, ají pineapple, sugar rush peach, and they're usually in the lower to moderate heat range. Some used fresh, some used dry, like this one, ají panca. Easily some of my favorite peppers. But the other South American species, Capsicum pubescens, often called rocoto, is where these get a bit more weird. This is the least well-known of the main pepper species. Until European contact, they don't actually seem to have spread at all from South America. Today, they're grown in Central America, but still haven't really spread much to the wider world. And it does make some sense. They're kind of the black sheep of the family, the most distantly related of the 5 species. They're kind of awkward to grow as well. They're better adapted for high elevation tropics. So they like it a bit cooler, but they also need those long tropical growing seasons. So not as great for growing either in the hot tropics or in the cooler temperate areas with their shorter summers. But if you can grow them, they are quite nice. So looking at them, you can see some definite distinctives. The plant, they are unique in having fuzzy leaves, hence the name pubescens, meaning hairy, and also purple flowers where most other peppers have white. But the fruit, they almost look a bit more like tomatoes from the outside, often a bit more of a squat shape like this. And then the surefire way to tell this species apart, cut them open and inside they're filled with black seeds, instead of the usual tan. And the taste, it's also one of the more unique ones I've tasted. It had a really strong paprika flavor to it, which I'd never really tasted in a non-dried pepper before, but also a slight tomatoey-ness to it. Some apparently have a bit of an apple taste to them, but this one, again, I actually thought had a bit of a note of pear instead. These range from everything from pretty mild to pretty hot, around habanero levels. They use them quite a few ways. They're good for stuffing, again, good in cream sauces. I had a lot of dishes where they came just sliced as a garnish on top. Definitely worth growing or tasting if you can. Now, you may be wondering, outside those 5 domesticated species, what about the other species, the wild ones? Well, to mention briefly, yes, many of those are actually also eaten. In the Andes, Peru, and especially Bolivia, many of those are wild harvested or grown in gardens and even sold in the markets. And they tend to look something like this. Tiny little berries in the red to yellow range, usually very small, but in other traits they're fairly diverse in their flavors, spice levels, and colors, and you can use them in similar ways to most other peppers. You just might need more of them. Unfortunately, I didn't get to try these. I wish I had bought some when I saw them in the market. I am thinking I might try growing some of my own next year. We'll see. But I think this next vegetable I'm actually even more excited to try growing. if I can find the right variety. So, the common bean, Phaseolus vulgaris. There's some debate where it comes from originally. Some suggest it was domesticated both in the Andes and Central America, both independently. Others suggest it was just Central America, and then it was brought down to the Andes where they developed their own varieties. This is the closest I had to show for an Andean bean. These are Myocobas. They were bred in Mexico, but from parents that probably both trace their origins back to the Andes. I would have used lima beans as a visual, which do get their name from Peru's capital, Lima, but they are a separate species. In any case, beans have been in the Andes for thousands of years, and today it's still one of the two hotspots of bean biodiversity. One of the fun recurring motifs in Moche ceramics is these bean warriors that show up with limbs, armor, and weapons. Now, the meaning behind these figures, if you're wondering, is a bit debated. Some posit that it's religious symbolism, some a symbol of social standing. Others have pointed out these bean warriors are sometimes seen fighting deer, so maybe some symbolism of fighting against the natural elements in order to raise crops. It's fun imagery in any case. But the one Andean bean I'd really like to highlight, and I hope to get my hands on some yet, Nuna. I saw some of these at the market in Cusco, but at the time didn't know what they were. Big regrets. These beans, they come in a variety of colors, but what's special about them is that these are beans you do not boil. Most beans, you have them dry and then you soak and then you boil them for a while, and then you get edible beans. If you have canned beans, that's already been done to them. Here, instead, you take the dry beans and you throw them in a pan and you pop them like popcorn. Or they don't pop quite as far as popcorn, more like cancha. More on that in the next section. But then you just maybe put some salt on them and you've got a toasty, crunchy snack. You can eat it just like that. Now, this might sound like just a fun novelty thing, but it's actually a really useful feature. To cook something, you need wood or some other type of fuel, and Peru is famous for its rainforests, but back in history, the largest populations were found up in the highlands, above the tree line. Today, if you look in the highlands, you will see a lot of these Australian eucalyptus trees, but these were only brought here in the 1960s and 70s. Before that, the area would be a lot more sparse for trees. Because of that, living up here, wood would be a precious resource, and if you need it, most of it would need to be brought in from down the eastern side of the mountains. Wood isn't your only option for fuel, but others like llama dung are also limited in their own ways. And problematically, many beans need long boiling times of an hour or two to become edible, and long boiling time means lots of fuel. Even more so here because the higher you go in elevation up these mountains, the lower the boiling point of water gets. So in Cusco, for instance, you have water boiling at about 89 degrees Celsius. So if you're not cooking as hot, you also have to go even longer using even more fuel. Here is why Nuna is so great. Compare the fuel needed to boil beans for several hours or to throw them in a pan and toast them for a few minutes. Far more fuel efficient, far more sustainable, and helpful today even if you're in a poorer or more remote area where electricity or cooking fuel might still be more limited, and probably helpful in other such areas around the globe. It's actually quite surprising that this one hasn't spread further yet as a good high protein, high fiber, high nutrient food. So I would love to demonstrate this, but can't get a hold of any at the moment. I really regret missing it at the market in Peru there. If any of you happen to know where I could get it online, I would be thrilled. I've only been able to find places that were either chronically sold out or didn't ship to Canada. What can you do? Anyway, let's talk about corn. So, corn has been in the Andes for a few thousand years at least. You can see it once again in artwork from all around the Andes, from the Inca going back to much earlier civilizations, such as this moche figure of a half-naked man holding a popcorn popper. Not sure if there's some sort of story behind this, but hey, don't let a lack of pants stand between you and a midnight snack, I guess. This plant, too, is thought to have first been domesticated in Mexico area from the teosinte plant, but it seems pretty soon afterwards it made its way down to the Andes. And then over the next few thousand years, they made their own varieties, spread them around, and Eventually, it became a main staple crop for some of these groups. And then it had a further boom when the Inca rose to power, late in pre-Columbian times. The Inca were corn people, and they made it into quite the prestige crop, claiming to be actually the ones who first brought corn to the Andes themselves. A few millennia of history say otherwise. You can even see this high regard for corn in this statue of Pachacuri here, the founder of the Inca Empire. See the little corn cob on his staff there. But the people of the Andes grew all kinds of corn. Different colors, shapes, sizes, and ones that you'd cook pretty differently from each other as well. Here in Canada, unless it's like, say, ground up in cornmeal muffins or maybe Mexican corn tortillas, usually we would use sweet corn taken before the corn has fully ripened and dried out on the plant. This type is less common in Peru. Europeans actually first got that sweet corn from North American indigenous peoples. One common food that's kind of similar in Peru, though, is choclo. These cobs with large kernels you can see at a lot of street vendors. They've got a very soft, chewy texture, and vendors in Peru will often serve them boiled with a slab of cheese on top. I did try this and also had choclo in a couple soups and stews, and it was quite good. I was expecting the cheese to pair weirdly with it, but I guess not being sweet corn, it actually did pair quite nicely. Kind of like how potatoes and cheese can go well together. But probably the most famous type of corn there, and also in Ecuador, is this one, Maíz morada, purple corn. These are loaded full of purple pigments, which, in addition to coloring food, can be used as a potent dye, one of many used in the very colorful traditional Andean textiles. For food and drink, one of Peru's national drinks, chicha morada, is made by boiling these cobs with some pineapple and sometimes a few other flavors like cinnamon. Quite a tasty drink if you get the chance to try it. There's also mazamorra morada, which is a pudding made with this, fruits, and again, a few other flavors. Now, I really like chicha morada, but by far my favorite Andean corn dish I've tasted is something much simpler. Say hello to cancha. If it weren't so expensive to buy this stuff imported, I could eat this every meal. For reference on that, I do eat popcorn maybe 5 out of 7 days a week. I'm a simple man. But these kernels are fully dry and are eaten dry. Kind of like corn nuts, but not quite the same. I much prefer these. Corn nuts did originally come from a Peruvian type of corn, but they're typically made by soaking and then roasting or frying. And you get this sort of intensely brittle, crunchy texture. Cancha, on the other hand, all you have to do is take the dry kernels and toast or fry them till they pop. Kind of like popcorn, but they don't pop as far. They just kind of crack open, and you have more of a toasty, powdery, crunchy texture. Oh, that's good. Larger kernels especially can be a bit powdery sometimes, but with the oil and salt, it balances nicely. You've got this really simple but nice roasty grain flavor. Just the right levels of savory and salty. Now, from experience, these can be dangerous, especially these guys here, Maíz chulpi. They are shaped like bullets and they fly like bullets. Like popcorn will fly from the pan, but it's got a lot of air resistance, so it'll slow down. This stuff does not. So I think the first time I made it, it was kind of terrifying. Probably confused the downstairs neighbors with all the ricochets and shrieks of panic. Word of advice, wear eye protection and cover the pan. But this is a common carb to eat with meals in Peru and Ecuador, and has been long before the coming of the Spanish. Today in Peru, a lot of meals will come with a small bowl of cancha, fried or toasted like this. You'll also see it put in one of Peru's national dishes, ceviche, this sort of pickled raw fish dish. You don't hear it described that way really, but I think that would be accurate. Marinated in citrus juice, if that sounds more appetizing. I won't weigh in on which country has the best ceviche. But yeah, definitely recommended if you're in Peru or one of the surrounding countries that eats this. I think being in Peru kind of gave me a new appreciation for corn. I'm fine with sweet corn, but I really like cancha. And these other vegetables too, the peppers, the beans, the potatoes. It's so easy to forget all the diversity of cultivated vegetables out there when all we see is the few that grow around us or the even smaller handful that get mass produced and end up in the grocery stores. But these are far from the only crops that come from the Andes, and there's quite a few that haven't made their way around the world yet. So in one of my next videos, I'll be looking at some fruits, nuts, and vegetables that are still fairly unique to the region. Some absolutely delicious, and I wish they would spread already. Some I'm very confused how to feel about. And if you want to see more about Andean farming and some of the impressive engineering these people groups pulled off, you can check out my previous video. To those who've watched it already, thank you. I was blown away with the responses to that one. My hope is to make more documentary style videos like that in the future. So if you'd like to see more videos like that, or more like this, and want to help support me making them, liking, commenting, subscribing, and sharing, those all really help me out. And if you'd like to support me further, you can find me on Patreon or YouTube memberships. Thanks again for your support. So in any case, for more plants, weird and wonderful, mundane and strange, join me next time on Ambling with Sam.